by a pretty decent margin to handle the situation in Israel over Biden, and particularly young voters by nearly 20 points were more likely to say they trusted Trump than Biden. Older voters by about 7 points said that they trusted Biden over Trump, but the public overall said that they trust Donald Trump more to handle the conflict in Israel.
So let's talk about the way the question is framed, because it can mean anything and it can mean everything. Were there debates about the wording of any questions in these particular polls?
In any poll, but in particular this poll, we wanted to be very careful and conscientious in how we worded the questions because, we know that the conflict between Israel and Gaza right now is very complicated, and even that choice of words I had now is really complicated, right? We had to really think carefully about when we're saying Gaza, when we're saying Palestinians, when we're saying Israel, when we're saying the Israeli government. Each of those decisions was very, very careful, and with any poll, we spend a lot of time thinking about question wording with sort of two main goals. The first is that a question feels fair to anybody who's being asked it. We want to represent every single voter in America, no matter their opinion, no matter where they sit on the political spectrum. And so that means that every voter in America should be able to look at these questions and say, I see myself in those answer choices. There's an answer choice there that represents how I feel. So that requires a lot of debate. And the second thing that we spend a lot of time doing is trying to ensure that the questions are interpreted the same by everybody who's answering them. Oftentimes with polls, we can get something called measurement error, where we think we're measuring something, but different respondents interpret it different ways. And so we, again, spend a lot of time being very careful and very precise.
Can you give me an example?
Yeah, so we wanted to understand this idea of a ceasefire. So if we just ask, are you in favor of a ceasefire, we might get a lot of measurement error there. Some people think a ceasefire is all the fighting stopping now. Some people might think a ceasefire is the fighting stopping as soon as, let's say, the hostages are released, or any number of conditions.
Or stopping forever with no
Or stopping forever, right, with no conditions. And just asking ceasefire is too broad a word that lots of people have different interpretations. So for me, as an analyst of polls, I wouldn't know how to interpret that data because everybody's bringing their own perspective to it. So instead, we have a forced choice option. Either Israel should stop its campaign in order to protect against civilian casualties, even if not all the hostages are released, or Israel should continue its military campaign until all the hostages are released, even if it means civilian casualties in Gaza might continue. Now, a lot of people might disagree with those answer choices, and I think it's very reasonable to disagree with those as the only two answer choices. But in doing that, we actually saw that the public is fairly split on that question, which I think is interesting. I think a good survey question does split the public more evenly.
Did you consider having more than two choices?
We did. We debated that pretty heavily, and there were times where we got close to having that as options. In the end, it makes it a lot more difficult to analyze the data the more options that you provide. Our goal here was this is a first volley into these things, and we find something interesting, we can ask additional questions and try to tease apart those groups as we go.
How many people did you poll overall?
We pulled a little over 1,000.
A typical number, but on the smaller side, right?
I mean, this is actually a current fallacy, I think, of polling and an issue for debate. So phone polling is traditionally around 1,000 adults or voters nationwide. There's a statistical principle called the central limit theorem, and that says when you get to a certain sample size, you have less variation over time, and 1,000 is around that sample size for U.S. adults. So while there are a lot of online surveys these days that have much larger sample sizes, I always stress to reporters a larger sample size isn't I think it's a good question to ask. I would draw a distinction between polls and the averages of polls, and then what some people layer on top of it, which are these probabilistic models that suggest how likely someone is to win. So I'll give an example. Biden is down by 2, and then they say, and that means that Biden has a 20% chance of winning. And it's that chance of winning that I think is really challenging for people to interpret. So imagine in 2016 when models said, for example, Hillary had a 70% chance of winning, a lot of people mentally rounded that up to 100 and then felt that she was guaranteed to win. So I think a lot of the behavioral changes that came out of this weren't just because of polling, but were because of these probabilistic models that were layered on top of polling.
Behavioral changes, meaning
If people decided to not vote, or there was some reporting that people were choosing to switch their votes, any of those kind of decisions, they were often because of this idea that they thought somebody had a 70% chance of winning, and so their behavior didn't make a difference in the outcome.
whereas a 30% chance of losing is still a big chance.
Huge.
If there are 30% chance of rain, you would ponder over bringing in umbrella.
Yes.
What are the top 3 things you'd like news consumers to keep in mind when interpreting poll responses?
One, don't focus on any single poll. Any single poll could be an outlier, so looking at multiple polls over time is hugely valuable. The second thing is be smart about what polls you're consuming. The metric I like to use to actually assess whether we think a poll is good quality or not really doesn't require